So, a very good evening to everyone, and I welcome you all for our webinar today. Good afternoon to Dr. Professor Antonio Stufkens, who's a very, very dear friend of ours. He had been with us a few years back, exactly in February 2018, here in Kolkata, as the chair of the IPA Exploratory Committee. And my memory of his genuine interest in IPS, our society, and his sincerity and warmth is still very much alive. I also welcome Mallika as our chair today and our colleagues and candidates from Delhi and Mumbai chapter. I would like to welcome Timothy, Louis, and all our other guests from different countries and different continents. Without much ado, I invite our President, Dr. Pushpa Mishra, for the welcome speech and to introduce our chair, Ms. Mallika Akbar, to our President.
So, on behalf of Indian Psychoanalytical Society, I welcome you all to this seminar. The paper Anthony actually sent to us, but we received it only just half an hour ago. So we are not able to, I think that many of us haven't been able to read it. I actually haven't been able to read it. As you can well understand, this is part of our ongoing monthly webinar as part of the celebration of our centenary. And everything already our secretary has said. We do remember Anthony with fondness, warmth, and very much very much interested in the goings on in the IPS. It was very nice to see him again, and I hope you will all enjoy his paper. And with this, I hand over the mic to Mallika.
Welcome, Anthony. Very happy to have you with us today. I can give you some biographical details about Anthony, so to familiarize him and his work. He's a training and supervising analyst of the Dutch Psychoanalytic Society. He has been practicing for 45 years, and now he says he's on the verge of retirement. Apart from all the writing that he has done, he has been president of the Foundation for Psychoanalytic Symposiums. He has helped organize yearly conferences for analysts, therapists, and mental health workers in Holland. And as director of the Amsterdam training program for Eastern Europe, he taught analysis in Lithuania, I think, for several years. So Anthony is also very active in the IPA, which is when we visited India a few years ago. And our candidates and all of us had a good experience with him. He read a paper, he worked with us for a brief while and left. I think we can ask Anthony to start with his paper, read his paper, and then perhaps we can talk about it later. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. Bharti, can I start? Yeah.
Sure, please.
Once upon a time, when mobile phones did not exist yet, in a prehistoric era, so to speak, more than 30 years ago, I was in the last part of the end phase of an analysis with a male patient. I had asked him what, in hindsight, he thought had helped him most. Although I do not exactly recall my question, I remember his answer vividly. That incident with my car. You have to know that my house and office are situated on a brick paved road which has some bulging. It is on both sides, it goes down a little bit. On a very cold winter morning, he had parked his car on the side of the street, which was frozen and slippery due to ice. After the session, he had tried to drive onto the street to leave, but to no avail. After having concluded that his effort was doomed to fail because his tires continued to skid, he returned to my door and asked via the intercom if he could use my phone to call for help from the Automobile Club's road service. I already had another patient in the waiting room and quickly asked myself what to do. Without much hesitation, I said that I would come and push him with his car onto the road, as I would have done when, for example, a neighbor had asked me for help in such a situation. So I did. He was a little bit surprised, but he gratefully took the steering wheel and he was quickly able to drive off. Although we must have discussed it afterwards, I had forgotten the incident. It obviously was much less significant for me than it was for him. When, at the end of his treatment, many years after this event, he recalled it and made clear how important my action had been for him, I was shocked. This had nothing to do with psychoanalysis. I guess that I had hoped that my brilliant interpretations would have had a lasting and life-changing impact on him, or that he had mentioned at least something connected with our work in the analysis, or the ways we had weathered the storms together. Nothing of that at all. I needed some time to digest his remark, although subsequently I could live with the symbolic content of it. It was as if he had said that I had helped him to become autonomous, auto and car, and to find his way back on track and set out for his life to come. There are some modern proposals about change in clinical analysis. And the question is, which factors contribute to psychic change? These proposals come from two frequently cited articles in psychoanalytic literature in the past years. Daniel Stern and his colleagues wrote about the non-interpretive mechanisms in psychoanalytic therapy, and Jessica Benjamin presented her version of intersubjectivity. In her article Beyond Doer and Done To, is it where she voices her stance. Speaking about change, we have, of course, the classical papers by Stretchy and by Lowald with divergent views of what it is that is transformational. However, I will refrain from any attempt to review even a small part of the extensive literature about change. Nor is it my intention to assert that it is the extra analytic factors, like the analyst's behavior outside the consulting room, that have mutative power. Although you now know that even pushing a patient's car can have a lasting effect. I would like to draw your attention to some ideas as proposed by Stern and his colleagues, by Benjamin, and also by Christopher Bollas, because they are central in the discussion about change, intersubjectivity, and enactment. I have many citations in my paper, and in order not to disturb the flow of my speech, I'm not going to say time and again, quote, unquote. So if you have the text, you see that correctly what are my words and what are the words of the people I cite. Now, next paragraph about the non-interpretive mechanisms. In the introduction to their paper, Stern and his colleagues say, this is the first quote, anecdotal evidence suggests that after most patients have completed a successful treatment, they tend to remember two kinds of nodal events that they believe changed them. One concerns the key interpretations that rearrange their interpsychic landscape. The other concerns special moments of authentic person-to-person connection with a therapist that alters the relationship with him or her and thereby the patient's sense of himself. The pivotal role of interpretations is acknowledged alongside what they call moments of meeting, the co-creation of a new intersubjective environment which equally or even more contributes to change. The paper we are talking about is by the Boston Process of Change Study Group and describes the something more than interpretation issue, which addresses the central question in our thinking about change. What is it, in fact, that causes psychic change? Since I cannot assume that it is known to everybody, I will summarize some of their main ideas. They focus on the interactional intersubjective process and implicit relational knowing. Furthermore, they take for granted the differentiation between declarative knowledge, which is explicit and conscious or preconscious, and procedural knowledge of relationships, which is implicit, unconscious, and represented non-symbolically. This latter knowing integrates affect, cognition, and behavioral interactive dimensions comparable to Bollas' unknown thought, and can remain outside awareness or later become symbolically, for example, verbally represented. Based on infant research, child development, and the study of mother-child interactions, they assert that this implicit relational knowing is registered in representations of interpersonal events in a non-symbolic form beginning in the first year of life. Speaking about the intersubjective relationship in treatment, they say, just as an interpretation is a therapeutic event that rearranges the patient's conscious declarative knowledge, we propose that what we will call a moment of meeting is the event that rearranges implicit relational knowing for patient and analyst alike. It is in this sense that the moment takes on cardinal importance as the basic unit of subjective change in the domain of implicit relational knowing. When a change occurs in the intersubjective environment, a moment of meeting will have precipitated it. The relationship, as implicitly known, has been altered. This changing mental actions and behaviors that assemble in this different context. This is the end of quote. So this moment of meeting, therapeutically seized and mutually realized, is, in their view, the nodal event in changing something in the patient-therapist relationship. It reflects something personal of the therapist as well as of the patient. It is a here and now moment with affective immediacy and spontaneous responses, and it transcends but does not abrogate the professional relationship and becomes partially freed of transferential, countertransferential overtones. All this is explained in more detail in the paper and connected with other concepts like the shared implicit relationship as the locus of mutative action, by which they mean that the process of change takes place in this shared implicit relationship. This change does not correct past failures in empathy, nor does it replace past deficit. Past experience is recontextualized in the present such that a person operates from within a different mental landscape, resulting in new behaviors and experiences in the present and future. In more global terms, the proposition may be clear now. It is in the intersubjective relationship that the change takes place in the present. This change, in its turn, causes a sort of mental transformation and psychic change. And in this process, procedural knowledge, implicit and unconscious, becomes this declarative knowledge, explicit and conscious. The clinical examples are too long to repeat now, but as an example of a moment of meeting in the child's world that creates an altered domain of implicit relational knowing, they mention an event between a father and a child. Imagine a young child visiting a playground with his father. The child rushes over to the slide and climbs the ladder. As he gets near the top, he feels a little anxious about the height and the limits of his new emerging skill. In a smoothly functioning dyadic system, he will look to his father as a guide to help him regulate his affective state. His father responds with a warm smile and a nod, perhaps moving a little closer to the child. The child goes up and over the top and gaining a new sense of mastery and fun. They have shared intersubjectively the affective sequence tied to the act. Such moments will occur again in support of the child's confident engagement with the world. So it is supposed that in the clinical encounter, this kind of moments, of course on another level, but with the same emotional and relational impact, alter the subjective environment which functions as a vehicle for change. It seems to me that the Boston group proposes redefining the intrapsychic as lived experience that is represented at the implicit level, as they call it in another paper. In a way, this proposition turns well-known traditional ideas about mental functioning upside down. Probably this is for many analysts not only a bridge too far, but it also claims priority of the intersubjective over the interpsychic, thereby neglecting the essential interdependence. Now, another perspective, the relational analysis perspective. The other most cited paper in the past decade is by Jessica Benjamin, a prolific advocate of her theory of intersubjectivity from a relational analytic point of view, which is a popular trend in the United States. This movement has a long history there in psychiatry and is psychoanalytically connected to Ferenczi. Benjamin's ideas are considered controversial by many colleagues who are of the opinion that they superficialize the analytic relationship, disregard history, abolish useful concepts, neglect Oedipal psychic conflict, or water down core analytic tenets. Some opponents fundamentally disagree with her on how clinical transformation, it is change, is achieved in analysis, and feel that ideas like hers make psychoanalysis into an interpersonal psychotherapy with talk about you and me, with too little space for formal regression, current expressions of infantile sexual conflicts, and other deeper elements of the Freudian unconscious. Benjamin mentions a large amount of thinkers who have inspired her, among others Hegel, Habermas, Lacan, Rucker, Winnicott, and Stern. I will give an impression of some of her ideas, for example, on thirdness, because it is directly linked with intersubjectivity, enactment, and change. In her article from 2004, she wants to move beyond thinking in terms of the one, the patient, doing something to the other, the analyst. As a result of this, she criticizes, for example, Steiner, referring to certain pages in his book on psychic retreats, because he refuses this step. She says he does not consider the symmetry between his reaction and her, the patient's reaction. And rather than disclosing that indeed he was feeling responsible and that he had gone too far, he rejects the possibility of confirming her observation. While Steiner accepts the tendency to be caught in enactment and the necessity for the analyst to be open-minded and inquiring in order to be helped by the patient's feedback, he insists that the analyst must cope by relying on his own understanding. Still a quote, Steiner's definition of containment excludes the possibility of a shared third, creating a dyadic system that contains, by virtue of mutual reflection on the interaction. Thus, he rejects the use of the intersubjective field to transform the conflict about responsibility into a shared third, an object of joint reflection. Another thirdness refers to her central concept of the moral third, those values, rules, and principles of interaction that we rely upon in our efforts to create and restore the space for each partner in the dyad to engage in thinking, feeling, acting, or responding, rather than merely reacting. In psychoanalysis, the belief itself in the reciprocal dynamic of surviving rupture and repair is the heart of the moral third. This means for her that the analyst has to take responsibility for enactments that result in an impasse or in a breakdown. This may all sound rather cryptic, theoretical. She's not always easy to understand, but these sentences give an impression of where she thinks change has to take place in the clinical situation. She, in fact, rejects the notion of the analyst as the one who is in a position to interpret the patient. She advocates for a mutual reflection on impasses and ruptures. In her eyes, the analyst must change internally and accept his participation in enactments and what she calls a symmetrical relation to the moral third. The position she chooses reflects her conviction that in the clinical situation, movements in and out of dissociation and impasses in both participants are the vital elements with a potential for change. These ruptures in the relationship are usually caused by or enveloped in enactments. And this is also why she rejects Steiner's idea that all enactment is in principle damaging to the analytic relationship. In a discussion with Levinson, who is of the opinion that enactment is a continuous and ubiquitous process, Steiner stresses that only understanding is of therapeutic value to the patient and that collusive enactments compromise the setting. For relational intersubjectivists, this is not only throwing the baby away with the bathwater. For them, enactments are the vehicles to change, but also too narrow a definition of enactment and an idealization of the analyst as the perfect container. In Benjamin's contribution to the psychoanalytic controversies and in the paper about her relational view of intersubjectivity, she is much more explicit about enactments and how they can produce change through new experiences of what she calls lawfulness and the recognition of feelings and intentions in an attachment relationship. She argues that rupture and repair are essential elements in the analytic relationship, and that the inevitable moments of dysregulation and dissociation in our processing of what is going on, the possible enactments that result, and the ensuing repair of therapeutic mistakes, misattunements, failure in regulation, that they are what actually allow development and change to occur. This dissociation is also an activity of the analyst. And in addition to the joint co-created occurrence of dissociation, rupture, and repair, she uses another term, which is that of the self as multiple. She asserts that the acceptance of the notion of dissociated self states is necessary to understand ruptures, impasses, and enactments. Furthermore, Benjamin says A correlate of the multiplicity postulate is that it is only through these, is that often it is only through these clinical manifestations that unheard, unrecognized aspects of the self can be known. She is convinced that traumatic material and painful effect from which the patient is dissociated can only be activated in relational enactments, and that it means that this way of understanding enactments is a departure from thinking about countertransference. She says that it literally, she says the term transference countertransference suggests an asymmetry that may no longer adequately conceptualize the interactive field. Although much of her thinking is understandable as a special way of trying to conceptualize certain elements of the analytic relationship, especially in the context of trauma or primitive pathology, this last step of abolishing the notion of asymmetry, in my view, undermines the idea of two separate minds with their own histories and its effects on the relationship. I now come to the inner experience of the analyst and Christopher Bollas. I mentioned him earlier in my paper, and I think that his way of understanding the analytic relationship and formulating what he sees as transformational deserves our attention. In a contribution to a book dedicated to the theory and treatment of primitive states called Regression in the Countertransference, he presents a schizophrenic patient called Nick and describes his experiences with him. Although this treatment was a psychotherapy with a hospitalized adolescent and not an analysis, I am convinced that what he is saying about change, not only in this chapter, but also in his book, The Shadow of the Object, is very relevant and will be easily recognized by the experienced analyst who has worked with severely disturbed or regressed patients. It refers to a mixture of exchanges of mental pre-verbal elements in the intersubjective space and to the ways in which the analyst gets involved in the patient's pathology. Projective identification in its modern version is useful here, and we can safely assume that the more severe the character pathology is, the more nonverbal behavior predominates. For a short description of the effects of projective identification on the clinician, I advise you to consult Cimino and Coriale, especially with regard to the loss of a metaphorical mind, the contraction of the field of perception, and the loss of the sense of self with concomitant anxiety and confusion. Bollas describes 4 stages in his countertransference to this extremely disturbing and disturbed young patient who, as he says, was a most strange, bizarre infant. He sat staring at me with a fixed gaze, a slightly mocking smirk playing across his face. He describes how he survived the sense of a lifeless non-entity and the loss of the integrity of the structure of the psychoanalytic process. Quote, I was living a marginal life, dominated by a nameless fear. Stage 1 was characterized by splitting, in which the analyst, by becoming talkative, adopted a false self-adaptiveness, leading to a loss of a sense of personal reality in work with the analysand. He calls him now an analysand. He explains that this effect was brought about by the patient presenting deep maternal refusal of interrelating, while the analyst experienced the child's loss of personal reality. Stage 2 was a period of experience of terror over survival, as the analyst is overcome by a dreadful silence that immobilizes his psyche soma. This is understood as the patient's presentation of maternal hate, of death wishes against the aliveness of the child. The analyst mobilized his fury into speech, and by speaking for the child to the patient, aggression became a way of surviving. In stage 3, the analyst took on the mother's personality. Bolas calls it the stage of the worrying mother, which he felt was a move by the patient, changing the analyst from child to mother. Quote, the analyst uses understanding and interpretation to recover from the regression into the mother's madness. In the fourth and last stage, the patient tried to coerce the analyst to see him as a behavioral object, what he calls the stage of desubjectification, in which it was the analyst's work to transform the mother's deadening of meaning into meaningfulness. Bolas describes how he sees these internal mad states as informative regression by the analyst, and as a result of how the very disturbed patient is unable to process meaning intra-subjectively, only inter-subjectively. There is an immediate area of experiencing in which the analyst bears split off portions of the patient's true self and its objects experiences, and is not sure at any moment who is carrying what and why at that time. This lack of boundaries is a condition for work in the intermediate area. And this is followed by a sentence which I consider indisputably crucial in the context of change. Bolas says, analytic insight and interpretation are in the first place curative for the analyst, who gets better first. Psychic change, in this instance, begins within the analyst. Only gradually, through interpretation, holding, and the passing of time, does the patient get better. Finally, I think analysands unconsciously appreciate that inner experience endured by the analyst. They know that he or she is living through their inner object world and through their history. Ogden describes similar phenomena and explains how the patient's retreat into a state of what he calls defensive non-experience is connected with the fact that all thoughts, fantasies, and feelings are stripped of meaning as a consequence of the early maternal refusal or inability to contain the infant's projective identifications. In Bolas' aforementioned book, He says that in order to find the patient, we must look for him within ourselves. And that, speaking about countertransference, there are two patients within the session and therefore two complementary sources of free association. He also asserted that the infant within the adult person cannot find a voice, however, unless the clinician allows the patient to affect him. And this inevitably means that the analyst must become disturbed by the patient. As a result, much of the work of analysis will have to take place within the analyst, who, through his situational illness, is the patient in greatest need, and as a consequence, has to treat his own illness first. In this way, Bollas is trying to find words for the pre- and non-verbal word of the patient, and he conveys his experience that time and again, when I am working to describe the non-verbal transference, the patient will join in and use his or her own verbal representations to speak elements of himself. He believes that what is mutative is a product of a mutual sense of having touched upon a detail in the session that gives both analyst and analysand a sense of appropriate conviction that the patient's true self has been found and registered. Bollas describes intersubjectivity in terms of transference and countertransference, and as being the result of specific elements in what he calls the patient's projectively identified psychic life. He is using well-known analytic terminology and concepts in contrast to the words of Benjamin and Stern, who are closer to common language, such as repair, rupture, and moments of meeting. As far as the content is concerned, his clinical theory and practice seem to come close to Stern's moments of meeting and to resemble Benjamin's objectives in the relationship. However, it is abundantly clear that the ideas about transference and countertransference disclosure of this renowned writer and clinician are embedded within a complex set of theoretical and technical assumptions about the therapeutic action of analysis. He upholds the analytical matrix of the asymmetric relationship, however much infected by the pathology of patients or disturbed by their enactments. And he will not get lost in only talking about you and me. I now come to my concluding remarks. Coming to the end of this presentation and referring to the question in my introduction, which factors contribute to psychic change, I would like to start with the following. Psychoanalysis has a problem with concepts, their meanings, and boundaries. Almost all terms I have used in this paper, change, countertransference, projective identification, enactment, intersubjectivity, all these concepts mean different things to the different psychoanalytic schools of thought. And as a consequence, the clinical use also differs widely. We have to be aware of the fact that intersubjectivity is not an analytic concept, and that it, in essence, only refers to a relationship between subjects. The so-called relational psychoanalysis, which is with its stress on intersubjectivity, is popular in North America and a sort of follow-up on the study of countertransference enactments. It is a concept not based on experienced transactions, but an abstract one that tries to describe a more equal element in the analytic encounter, without being able till now to describe and define it clearly. As far as mutual enactments and psychic change are connected, I do not see how, in the immediacy of the unconscious communication and in the co-creation of meaning and recognition, both participants could not change. I am convinced that some or most of those transformations have to start in the analyst, who, with every patient, but especially with the regressed or very disturbed analysand, is the one who has to think and dream for both himself and his patient. We should neither idealize nor condemn enactments. They are just inevitable clinical facts and have to be treated as such. I believe that speaking about change, there's more than one way to Rome, and it can be, as Stern asserts, that there first is a change in the relationship as implicitly known, which afterwards can be decoded and interpreted towards the interpsychic constellation and become interpretation, from implicit to declarative knowledge, so to say. I think that enactment is an important area for reflection, but that Benjamin, with her exclusive attention to the intersubjective, is on too small a track, although much of what she says concerning the attitude and role of the analyst is worth studying. Working analytically asks for good analytic theory, a solid, also internal analytic setting, knowledge of psychopathology, including one's own, and an idea and some experience how to combine all these elements into interventions that are useful for the analysand. I contend that the interpsychic and the intersubjective are inseparable, and that some ideas contain a tendency to replace the interpsychic by the interpersonal. I think technically, clinically, we should try to avoid everything that distracts from empathy and from a thorough investigation of the multiform, multi-layered, and multi-determined psychic reality of the analysand. I believe with Green that drive and object are inseparable, and that as a consequence, the interpersonal or intersubjective and the interpsychic are two sides of the same coin. Although it is valuable to try to gain insight into the processes that lead to change, one has to be careful not to lose one's way in questions about priority of one essential element in the clinical encounter over the other. Coming back to pushing my patient's car onto the road. One may wonder what my action with the patient's car has to do with the content of this paper. My patient's response was spontaneous and unwaveringly clear. It had been a transformative experience. Has it been a moment of meeting in Stern's sense? I don't think so, although it was indubitably a quite unexpected person-to-person moment of connection between us, initiated by my spontaneous offer. Has this been something that changed the patient's implicit relational knowing? Possibly. He was a little bit surprised, I suppose that he had not expected my gesture. Has it changed the intersubjective field? Maybe. Do we know whether it was an enactment in Benjamin's terms? Or is it useless to try to describe my action in these terms? I do not know. Is it in some way connected with Boller's ideas about the analyst who changes, or with his countertransference disclosure? I don't think so. One thing I know. Since everybody nowadays has a mobile phone, were such a situation to happen again, he or she will not return to my door for help. But if someone did, I would not hesitate to do it again. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Tom. It was really a very nice and kind of a classical paper. However, many times you read it, you gain something new out of it. So I would like to ask Mallika to say something about it.
Thank you very much, Anthony, for clearly and dispassionately exploring analytic concepts which have different meanings for different theorists. If there's one feature which stands out here for me, it is your openness and lack of rigidity when considering points of view which differ from your own. This is evident throughout the paper. For example, while Jessica Benjamin and other intersubjectivists believe that enactments are the vehicles for change, Steiner holds that all enactment is in principle harmful to the analytic relationship. And even as the debate rages, you point out the truth that enactments are inevitable clinical facts, and each analytic couple does with them what it can. This is what I've understood, yeah?
Yeah.
Which brings us to the moot question addressed here. What brings about psychic change? What exactly is transformational in the course of a long, intense, patient-analyst relationship? While many viewpoints and answers emerge here, each, in a sense, vying to be more meaningful than the other, it does seem that the one answer which makes sense to me, at least, is that we don't really know what brings about psychic change. Does change happen only in the analytic room? Are interpretations the agent of change? How do we, patient and analyst, access what is unmentalized and unrepresented? This paper, for me, again, assigns utmost significance to the analyst-patient relationship, to how able and willing the analyst is to be disturbed and transformed by what the patient brings, verbally and non-verbally. Anthony here speaks of the significance of the analyst's empathy. But perhaps what is also needed is a capacity to be emotionally involved with the patient, to plunge with him into very muddy waters, to feel his unfelt feelings, and eventually hope to make sense of and come to terms with what has been feared, what is unthinkable, what has been denied, what has been unseen, and perhaps what has been undreamt. Thank you, Anthony. And if there are people in the audience who'd like to ask him questions, please feel free.
Thank you. I'll wait for other people to join us.
Yeah, we'll wait.
Can I ask a question?
Sure, Louise.
Yes, of course. Yeah.
Thank you. Hello, I'm Louise
Hi.
Guyler from the Australian Society. Thank you. Thank you for the paper and thank you for the discussion. My mind's still very much, Antonius, on the end of your paper and your statement about your patient and the help you offered with the car, and that you seem to discount the models you'd put forward as trying to capture what happened between you and your patient. But nevertheless, you said you would do it again. And I don't disagree with you on that. So I'm not disagreeing with your actions. But what I want to ask, if we think that psychoanalysis is an ethical practice, you know, that we need to increase benefit and decrease harm, in a sense, we do need to have a model that in which we put our behavior and our functioning in relation to our patients. And I'm just really curious about what model would allow your action in relation to your patient.
Maybe it's not an answer to your question. Thank you for this comment, but just an hour ago, I thought maybe you know that the word therapy has a Greek core in it. The Greek core is therapeio, a Greek word, which means in fact offering services on the battlefield. This is the core of the essence of the meaning of the word. So helping, let's say, a fellow soldier when wounded, even in the medical sense, offering help. So let's say if you seek a model for therapeutical action, then the pushing the car is part of it, isn't it? So I said in the beginning, in the end, I understood his answer to me as symbolic, in the sense that it contained everything that had offered him an opportunity to go out and live his own life, back on track, so to speak. This is not a analytical model, it is a therapeutical model.
Can I do a follow-up? Can I be devil's advocate and say, how do you distinguish, and sometimes we hear it in our profession or certainly in psychiatry, where someone's inhibited sexually and they say to their, it's usually a female patient, a male doctor, and they say, it will help me if you have sex with me. So we hear that, we've all got examples of that.
Yeah.
How do you differ, and that's doing service, how do we differentiate that action from your action?
This is a transgression, and we have our boundaries in this sense, and
Yeah.
also in the physical integrity of the body. So this is something which, on both sides, maybe can offer something, but in which it's clear that it's malpractice. I don't see my pushing the patient's car as malpractice.
No. But symbolically, it could be. The car could stand for the body, couldn't it?
Yes.
Pushing the body out. I mean, there's obviously a difference between sexual boundary violations and non-sexual boundary movements. But yeah, it's just whether there was a conceptual model that helped us differentiate actions that are in the service of patients and actions that actually transgress, whether they're non-sexual or sexual boundary violations.
May I ask you a question? If a patient is unable to speak for some reason, and you have no, let's say, analytical means to pass that by, to find a version, literally, I mean, and the inability to speak, and if the patient asks for a glass of water, would you give it to the patient?
When you mean inability to speak, you mean
the dry mouth or everything, which might prevent.
Oh, right. So physically they were, yeah. Mainly the patient may go and get themselves a glass of water, yeah, or
they go out of the room.
But I've actually had, if you mean, I had someone who, a diabetic patient once, who started to struggle and needed some sugar. I certainly went and got the best I could of something sugary. That's
yeah, and afterwards you can try to investigate the question and your reaction and discuss it. Symbolize it in a more verbal sense, but there are some things. I said it was spontaneous. This action of mine was a spontaneous gesture. I didn't think 5 minutes about it. I didn't think 5 minutes about it. As I said, when a neighbor would have asked something, I would have done it this way. Yeah.
Would that, in that sense, it would be like more Winnicottian would be the rationale for it. I don't know what theoretical models you do use, but in terms of Winnicott and the spontaneous gesture.
Yeah, and if it is a spontaneous gesture, you can say, is it an enactment? Is it an enactment? Is it something which comes out of the non-verbal, non-represented part of me wanting to help this patient? Do you agree? I don't hear her anymore.
Yes, I'm just conscious. I think there are other people on the chat wanting to ask questions. So.
Yeah, probably Adriana wants to say something.
Question.
Yeah, probably Adriana wants to.
Yeah.
Adriana, you need to unmute yourself.
Okay. Is it okay now, Bertie?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I want to say hello to all of you. and to Ton, especially, and all of you for inviting me, especially to the IPS, to these webinars, which I've been having the honor, and pleasure of being again. So it's really a joy to see you, to see you all.
You too.
It really is. It really is. Just about this exchange between Ton and the lady who just spoke before, I think something came to my mind, so that's why I've said it's very different for me when a patient says what you suggested, the lady, I forgot your name, in the session, because there you were in the session, and when a patient asks you for this, can we not do this or that, then you analyze because you are in the session. And so you work with that in the session. I think it's different because in Ton's situation, the session has ended and it was something that was happening. And obviously, I think that is a big change. It's very different, the setting. And of course, and I'm sure Ton did deal with it in the next session when the patient came. But I think mainly that the model, I think, with the patient is to follow is always about an unconscious experience in transference. And I think it's about following what the patient says. I think it's more that we follow the patient and see what happens. And I agree that enactment itself is not to, as one says, to idealize or or demonize it, as with many other things. It's just when it happens, I think are these unconscious interactions that are there, and that part of our work, and it's about following it and see. And I think psychic change is not also, I mean, for me, an aim of analytic treatment. I mean, people come because they are stuck with themselves at some point. They're finding something that they cannot go on, and that's why they come. And then change comes as a result of the work, but we don't know in which direction. We don't know what it is. It's about seeing if by talking the person, and find and discover new things that let them unlock. And we don't know what happened, as Ton says it with his patient, what really happened, what touched him. And of course, we can see this symbolic effect of that there was something stuck, and he was able to unlock that and go on his own. But we don't know about what about that touched him and helped him and moved in other ways and other things in his life. That's it. Thank you, Mallika. Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Adriana.
Mm-hmm.
I think somebody has put a question through chat. Yeah.
Do I read it out? How can we differentiate which enactments need to be interpreted psychoanalytically and which enactments need not be interpreted in a therapeutic setting?
Has he heard the question? No.
Yeah. Would you like to say something, Don?
Yes. In principle, every enactment, but it would be very boring if you have to put salt on every snail's tail. This is the way we say that it is not helpful to 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 investigate, I think, every enactment.
Bharti, may I make one comment?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, thank you. So I just wanted to say that it was a very comprehensive and very beautifully written paper, and it went through, um, uh, the whole work of so many analysts. So it covered a huge theoretical ground as well. And coming from India, I would say that the entire formation and the structuring of the self is in a web of relationships, which is what is prioritized throughout our life. So this paper makes very good sense. And I think from the comments also, we can see how culturally psychoanalysis travels and its predicaments. There are different ways in which it is being responded to. But I thought what was the beauty of the paper was the analyst's ability to be himself and to be free. And I feel that whenever an analyst is able to be himself or herself and be free, that does become a moment of meeting or a moment of recognition or a moment of transformation for the patient. So just adding that to, the comments that Mallika already made in a very elaborate manner on what constitutes, what leads to psychic change, and also Anthony's entire paper as such. So I was thinking that even Winnicott in one of his papers, he says that the analyst does not have to be an as if mother, but sometimes the analyst has to be the mother. And on the discussion, I was thinking between whether these two these two lie on the same continuum, having sex with the patient who is sexually inhibited and helping the patient with the pushing of the car. My own thought is that when we are helping the patient push the car, it is like the speaker before said, it is like what is the meaning of touch in psychoanalysis. We are touching the core of the patient in some sense by pushing the car in a spontaneous gesture of meeting the patient there unconsciously. But when we are aligning to have sex with the patient, the fantasy that we generate in the patient of privacy and exclusivity in the relationship is a very, very different thing. So I feel the two are positioned at unconscious spaces in different realms, and therefore possibly the impact of both of them would be very, very different, and they cannot be kept in the same breath. The analyst who moves the car is doing something consciously, unconsciously put together, but without interpretation or without conscious recognition of his action. And therefore also, perhaps in my understanding, perhaps it doesn't need to be brought into interpretation in the next session. I feel it will be absorbed both in the intersubjective and the intrapsychic realms by the patient and the analyst, and what it will do is possibly of bringing in a smoothness, a moving on in the analysis on the parts where the patient is possibly struck, and similarly something for the analyst also, transformation of something where he too in his own life may be stuck as a human being. So that was just my response.
Thank you, honey.
May I react to that?
Sure, Don.
I'm sure that the next session we have discussed this. I have discussed this with the patient. For example, in the question, what has it meant to you that I came down and pushed your car to the road? I cannot imagine that I just left it unsymbolized in a way. But I couldn't remember it because the patient came back to that event many years after the moment that it happened. So I'm sure that we discussed it. but I have no memory of it. And I think that the meeting, the kind of meeting is not as a professional, but as a sort of human being willing to be of help. There was another point, and that is we had no mobile phones. Thus I had him to let into the house to go to the office to my room, and then there trying to phone. So this would be a nuisance in that situation. This was an easy way to quickly resolve the point. About the change, maybe many analysts know that much of the change in patients occurs after the end of the treatment. Usually we say take 2 to 1 or 2 years after having terminated, and then change. You will discover that there in those years change will happen which did not happen during the analysis. I don't know about if this is proved by research, but usually we say to each other, at least, things like this. Change also occurs after the treatment.
Would you like to tell us a little more about this? Why does change take place only after the treatment is over? What do you think about it?
I think
why not?
Yeah.
I mean, is it something that has been explored but not heeded at that moment? What is it?
Yes. There is much disturbed mentally during the treatment, and that after having terminated or closed, there is a sort of reintegration of what has happened, usually also outside of consciousness. So it just happens, let's say, unconsciously. And maybe it's your own experience that if you ask people afterwards, what have we talked about during all those years? They don't remember. Most of them can't say what we discussed.
But it could well be the other way around as well, right? They could get worse because it hasn't been explored, or whatever was discussed left them disturbed. Yeah? That after a few years their condition could worsen.
Yes, it's only 1 in 4. So if about effects of the analytical treatment, we usually know that, let's say, 66, 67% gets better. In the rest of the percentage, there are some people who didn't change at all, it didn't help, and the small percentages, it's 20%, I believe, gets worse. Yeah, but that's research. That's researched. Yeah. And the strange thing is that it is not also that it's not only for psychoanalysis, but for every form of psychotherapy.
All right. Timothy wants to say something.
Oh, thank you very much. Firstly, thank you so much, Pushpa and Bhati, for inviting me to these ongoing celebrations of the centenary, which are marvelous. And also thank you, Antonius, for your lovely paper, raising so many thoughts as you spoke. The focus for me was really thinking about the nature of the unconscious, how we view the unconscious, where it exists, intrapsychically, interpersonally, even transpersonally, and thinking about the relationship between the unconscious and enactments. How we think about the nature of the unconscious very much determines our approach to how we think about an enactment. And I agree with you, it seems rather rigid to either rule them out totally or say they're the only thing. But the point I wanted to come to was, from my point of view, how I think about and work with enactments has a lot to do with my view about unconscious fantasy. My understanding is that the relational analysts really have quite a particular view about unconscious fantasy. And so if, as you said, you know, dealing with an enactment is really about exploring it, elaborating it, and that might involve actually bringing it from the implicit to the declarative. Then for me, psychic fantasy and how you view it, which is related to the unconscious, is a very important part. And I just wondered, you didn't touch on that particular issue, psychic fantasy, when you were comparing and contrasting. And I wondered if you had any thoughts about that. And so that's a question for you to consider. And I also wanted to ask our Indian colleagues what the perspective might be from the theory that Dr. Bose articulated. Would anybody like to comment on that?
I think I would like to say something in response to Timothy, because he asked something about Indian colleagues. Culture actually does play a very important role here. Here in India, our relationships are very strongly made, and our society actually is very closely bonded. For example, quite a few of my students, former students, are taking training under me. It's really very difficult just to forget that they were ever my student. We try it very hard, but sometimes certain other things happen. For example, if there is a festival and there is a ritual, like in Kolkata, there is a ritual after a certain festive occasion to touch the feet of your teacher to show respect. And you know, inevitably they will actually touch the feet. I'm speaking about Vijaya Dashami. So they would actually inevitably touch the feet of the teacher, and they consider their analyst as their teacher. So this will be probably extremely rude if we actually do not allow them to do this. Also, in addition to this, I'm also narrating an incident that happened to me. A patient of mine, it has happened long ago. A patient of mine who was young at that time, was about 24, 25, and also a former student of mine. She had actually studied full major, philosophy major with me. So she came from an extremely troubled circumstances. One day when she came to give her session, as soon as my door opened and the previous patient went out, she was sitting on the sofa. She started to come to the room and she fainted. She was just about to fall on the ground. So I held her, I lay her down on my sofa, which was in the waiting room. And after a little while, she became conscious. So I asked her what had happened. Was she ill? Did she have fever? Anything? And she then confessed that she had not eaten anything for the last 2-3 days. She comes from a very poor family. And it was, I considered it inhuman to just let her go like that. And she was still shaking. So I made a cup of tea. I gave her a cup of tea, with a few biscuits. And she ate it, and I told her that you just go home and take rest and try to eat something if you can manage. So these are the kind of things that we simply cannot ignore. This is also done from a very humanitarian point of view, I think this would have been inhuman on my part not to do something to this patient who has actually fainted because of hunger. So these are the kind of things that we have to take into account. But at the same time, I was also thinking that what Antonio has said, that it was an act which he would have done for his neighbor also. But the question is that for the neighbor, it would not have been a life transforming experience, but to the patient, it is a transforming experience. So the two situations are not comparable. And there must be, I mean, the patient's reaction to Antonio's action must be viewed in the background of the analysis, the entire analytic process, his transference in whatever he has said up to this, his relationship with the analyst, and must have what actually happened in his own mind, what brought about the change, a recognition by his analyst or a recognition by the analyst whom he holds in high esteem, that he is actually accepting him, all these things. So there has to be some analytical background which has brought about this change in the analyst. It probably cannot be compared merely to our action to a neighbor. Maybe Antonius can say something about it.
Yeah. I agree with you, and there comes the girl, the hungry girl, or the fainting girl. That this is a way of behaving natural with your patient at that moment, because there is a problem in reality which has to be solved. You can speak afterwards about it, but. Who was the one who, Annie Reich, I believe, who said it is vital that you are able to have a natural relationship with your patient, which is not outside the professional relationship, which is not outside all transference and countertransference, but which feels natural on the moments when in reality something happens. A hungry patient, a patient who is unable to drive away, and I think many situations analysts do something and can question why you have the answer. You couldn't talk with your patient in that state, isn't it?
No, I couldn't. Not in that state. Later on, I did talk about it in subsequent sessions.
Yes. May I say something to Timothy about the psychic fantasy and the unconscious fantasy? I have the impression that it is too complicated a topic to discuss now and to bring in contact with my paper.
Yes, well, I guess just to then maybe add it as a general comment, that firstly, how we differ with enactments, firstly, is how we elaborate them. How we elaborate them has to do with our view about the nature of the unconscious. Part of that has to do with particularly how we view unconscious fantasy. And so with your example, with Pushpa's example, in the later elaboration, which you both agree is important, you would be operating from a view about unconscious fantasy. My understanding is that the relational analysts sort of have a very different approach to unconscious fantasy. And I think it links with what you were saying. It's sort of very much more in the limited depths of what's going on between us interpersonally. And I think something important gets very lost. But I think we're just singing from the same book here.
Yes, I mentioned, I don't remember who it was, the Freudian unconscious. Who was it who said it? Maybe you remember. A commentary. Yes. David Tuckett.
Yes.
I mentioned him. Too little space for formal regression, current expressions of infantile sexual conflicts, and other deeper elements of the Freudian unconscious. Yes, and I agree with you. It is also my impression, although I didn't study them thoroughly, these relational analysts, that they don't touch or reach the deeper levels of the mind, including the unconscious fantasy.
Yes, and I might also just add finally, their emphasis on disclosure by the analyst, personal disclosure, I think links with my view about their approach to unconscious fantasy as well. That in my mind, it's far too much personal disclosure that could be considered helpful to the process.
Yes.
I think there are quite a few questions in the chat. There is one, which factor or factors determine whether enactment would bring about therapeutic change without needing any interpretation, or B, it requires interpretation to facilitate therapeutic change in the context of an enactment. So, Antonius, would you like to answer this question?
Yes, if you repeat it again, what exactly, yeah.
Yeah, which factor or factors determine whether, number one, enactment would bring about therapeutic change without needing any interpretation, or number two, it requires interpretation to facilitate therapeutic change in the context of an enactment?
Yeah, well, I think I answered it in a very shorthand way by saying that, in my view, every enactment needs discussion and interpretation, at least understanding. And this is part of the question Timothy had about we have to investigate the fantasy behind the enactment. And now the point is it possible to make a list of enactments which need absolutely interpretation, and enactments which pass by without discussion in a way. So I said, in my country, there is a saying that you need not have salt for the tail of every snake, that they disappear. So there are of course things that pass by without interpretation. I think but the question is, which kind of enactments? I don't know. You have to specify, what are you talking about? Is the last sentence, before patients shut the door behind them, is that something of an enactment? that has to be interpreted? I think yes. Depending on how forcefully the door was closed. Is that an enactment? Yes. So my rule would be, in principle, but I have no list of situations in which you could say it passes without consideration.
I have a question, Antonius. A patient shutting the door very roughly, wouldn't that be an acting out?
Yes.
Because it's just him. It's not the two of you together, right? It's not relational. So that is acting out. That's not an enactment, you know? It's distinct.
Oh, yes. But then we have to talk about the difference between acting out and enactment.
Yes.
For me, it's an enactment. Not because it is outside. It is a message to me.
It is, but it's only one of the analytic dyad doing that. In a sense, you're outside what he's doing. Whereas in enactment, it's the two of you, it's co-relational. It's always relational, isn't it?
No, not in my view. Not in my view. No. An enactment means enacting something that is not symbolized, or as you mentioned the word before, it is about unrepresented material.
Which is received by the analyst and understood, and so there's something dyadic. Anyway, I could be wrong.
It is dyadic in the sense that, let's say, the exit line, as it is called, and the gesture, for example, forcefully closing the door, is a message to me. And at the same time...
And you receive it.
And at the same time, it is a way in which the patient shows that he or she is unable to express his or her anger or being unsatisfied in another way. So in that sense, it is acting out, but it still is an enactment because it's an act, instead of, or as a message for something. So I've come to the conclusion that the acting out idea is a somewhat old-fashioned idea about something the patient does, as if it has nothing to do with me. Maybe I have created this action.
Possible.
Well, if there are no other questions, I would like to ask something. There were two things that kind of stayed with me. One is that intersubjectivity is not an analytic concept. So are we saying that countertransference is, whereas intersubjectivity is just one part of the whole of countertransference gamut? That is one thing. Or is intersubjectivity the way it was discussed not only in the paper, but as a theme or as a relational analyst, the way they view it, does it become a different theme altogether? That is one thing. And another, a little off the topic here, is I was just wondering about what you said is that most of the transformation has to start within the analyst first. So that puts a lot of responsibilities onto the analyst. And it also kind of emphasizes on the hierarchy, which Benjamin kind of negates. So I would just like to have your comment on that, because it's a very heavy responsibility. Normally, analysts kind of say difficult patient and try to throw the patient and put the blame on the patient. And herein you are saying that the transformation has to begin in the analyst first. So probably what you're also saying is, if that cannot happen, then the transformation in the process and in the analysant cannot happen too. So
Yeah.
I would like to have your comment on this.
Yeah. Yeah. You confront me, Bharti, with three terms: asymmetry, hierarchy, and responsibility. It would take a whole new seminar to discuss this thoroughly. As far as responsibility is concerned, let me start with this and my opinion about it. The patient is consulting you, believing that you know something, that you know something more than the patient. The responsibility is that you present yourself as someone who knows certain things, maybe who knows certain things in another way than the patient knows. You know, this is a sidestep that Freud said the patient knows everything already before you know. But there is a certain expertise which is expected from you and which you sell. If you sell it, you have the responsibility that the patient gets what he or she pays for. It's as simple as that. That is your responsibility, which means that studying, in this case, psychoanalysis, having your life in a way organized so that you are able to practice your profession. Eventually, all other things that are needed to be able to bear this responsibility, this is what you have to do as a professional. It's maybe not only for the psychoanalyst, but let's say a surgeon who is performing heart surgery has to study, has to be able to know the case. And it's not a question of 5 minutes before he takes his knife saying, what is this about? So this is the responsibility of the professional in our case. The hierarchy is a hierarchy only in respect to a specific knowledge we pretend to have. Especially, I come back to Timothy, about the unconscious and unconscious fantasy, and about early life and about development, etc., which we suppose the patient has not, at least not in the sense we have it. This makes an asymmetric relationship only in this respect. I come back to what I said before, to the question, what is the core of the therapy? The therapeutic action is okay. Can I go on?
Yes, please.
The rest is a fellow human being, in fact. This is the kind of background from which you can behave naturally with the patient without losing the asymmetric relationship as far as the treatment is concerned. So is it okay that with these three with this words, I have covered your question of these three concepts: asymmetry, responsibility, and hierarchy.
Yeah. Yes. And if we have time, just another thing that I was asking, is this intersubjectivity just one part of this big umbrella of countertransference, or is it taken as something else?
My personal experience after this 45 years behind the couch is I prefer to confine myself to the countertransference universe, and that intersubjectivity is another way of saying that there is an interpersonal relationship, but the interpersonal relationship is between two persons. Transpersonals was another word what was used today. That we have for almost 100 years of experience and knowledge about transference and countertransference. I think you are obliged to study it before you speak about intersubjectivity or other things which would be central in the relationship. We know more than that, is my view.
I totally agree.
This I couldn't do it. I didn't hear you.
I said I totally agree.
Okay.
But all right, if we have any other questions or comments. Well, I just wanted to say a couple of lines about the earlier discussion, which about this enactment and pushing the car and with other things. I think your paper itself says something about it, where you said for the analytic process to happen, you need to have very solid internal analytic boundaries. So I think if the internal boundaries are in place, then probably the external actions, enactments, or acting out can be brought in the session and can be made use of. But if the internal boundaries are not there, either the external boundaries would be very rigid or they wouldn't be made use of. That is what I thought at that point of discussion.
Yeah. Yeah. And that is indeed also a part of your moral responsibility, isn't it? Yeah.
Yes. So if we don't have any more questions, then probably it's our time to close. Is there any question or comment? Pushpadi or Mallika, would you like to say something?
Fine. Thank you. That's all.
I don't have anything to say. I think more or less we have discussed the questions, transference, countertransference, and how the action of the analyst is being interpreted by the patient. That always happens, that remains. I mean, even after analysis is over, the analyst remains analyst for a very long time.
Yeah, as the saying goes, once an analyst, always an analyst.
Yeah.
Yeah. So probably now it's time to thank everybody. And I thank you, Ton, Dr. Professor Antonio Stufkens, for being here, for accepting our request for the webinar. I thank you, Mallika, for chairing our webinar. I thank our guest from abroad, Adriana, and I thank all our team members from Kolkata, our candidates and colleagues from Delhi and Mumbai chapter. I must thank Debjani for her creative input and Anoma for the digital support. And I thank you, all the audience, for being here with us today, and all the IPS members for being with us all the time, being together. So that is why we are here today, and we are continuing with our celebration, though not in person, but at least online. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
It
And
was
you.
my, I wait for you.